The sun hung high in the sky, casting a harsh glare over the bustling city street. It was the kind of heat that made everyone move a little slower, as if the very air was pressing down on them. People walked past the small store, ignoring its chipped paint and cluttered windows. The shop owner, an elderly man named Walter, sat behind the counter, his thick glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He had seen many faces pass through his store over the years, but today was different. Marcus strode in tall, well-dressed, and exuding confidence. His leather jacket fit him perfectly, his shoes polished to a shine. He scanned the shelves, picking up a bottle of soda, his eyes briefly catching the reflection in the glass as he turned it over in his hands. Walter, sitting just a few feet away, narrowed his eyes. The young man didn't belong here. There was something about him that made Walter uneasy. The neighborhood had changed over the years, and he couldn't help but notice that the newer faces didn't look like the ones he was used to. He grumbled to himself, muttering under his breath as he adjusted his glasses. Marcus walked to the counter, placing the soda down, his fingers brushing the polished surface. "Good afternoon," Marcus said, offering a smile. Walter stared at him, his face hardening. "People like you have no place here," he muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. He looked at the young man with an air of suspicion, unsure of how to deal with the stranger standing before him. Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "I'm just here for a soda, sir." Walter didn't respond right away, his mind already racing. A few moments later, he stood up and grabbed the phone behind the counter, his fingers trembling slightly. He dialed the number for the police, not bothering to hide his voice as he spoke. "There's a man in my store, acting suspicious. I don't feel safe. Could you send someone over here?" As he hung up the phone, Walter felt a small sense of triumph. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He couldn't stand the thought of what the neighborhood was becoming. But Marcus stood there silently, watching the old man. His expression hadn't changed, but the air in the store had shifted. "I'll be on my way," then Marcus said, picking up his soda and turning toward the door. Walter watched him leave, unaware of the man's true identity. The sirens would be here soon, he thought. He would explain everything to the officers, and they would take care of the problem. But what Walter didn't know was that the young man he had just tried to have arrested wasn't just any man. Marcus wasn't a random stranger in his store. He wasn't a troublemaker or an intruder. In fact, Marcus wasn't even supposed to be in this neighborhood today. But fate had a different plan. Marcus wasn't just a visitor. He was the new chief of police, freshly appointed, and unknown to most of the city. The weight of the badge in his pocket was heavier than Walter could have ever imagined. As Marcus stepped out onto the street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. The call was from his new assistant. The assistant was rattling off details about the department, but Marcus barely heard him. He was still processing what had just happened. The old man had actually called the cops on him, and he had no idea who he was dealing with. Marcus shook his head, his thoughts already turning to the upcoming confrontation. Before he could respond to his assistant, the sound of sirens reached his ears. Two patrol cars screeched to a halt right outside Walter's store. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. The officers stepped out of the car, ready for whatever trouble had brought them here. They had no idea who Marcus was, just like the shop owner. They didn't know that they were about to meet someone who could change everything. Walter, watching from the store, saw the officers approach and smiled to himself, thinking his call had been justified. The man would be arrested, and his neighborhood would be safe again. But as Marcus stepped forward, he couldn't help but feel the tension thickening in the air. He wasn't here to get arrested. He wasn't here for a confrontation. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was the kind of test he would have to face as the new chief. The old man had made a serious mistake, one he would regret soon enough. Marcus didn't need to say anything to the officers. As they approached, he lifted his head, locking eyes with Walter, who was still standing inside his store. "Sir," one of the officers said, You called us about a situation here. Marcus felt his heartbeat quicken. He could already feel the weight of the moment. This would be the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could have anticipated. Before Marcus could respond, Walter stepped forward, eager to explain his side of the story. This man was acting suspicious. He doesn't belong here. The officer looked from Walter to Marcus, confusion spreading across his face. Walter's voice grew louder. He doesn't belong in this neighborhood. People like him have no place here. Marcus, unfazed, stepped forward. I think you'll find I do, actually. The officer's eyes widened. Something was off, but before he could react, Marcus reached into his jacket, pulling out his badge. Walter's expression froze as the reality of the situation hit in. Marcus was the new chief of police. The tension between Marcus and Walter hung thick in the air, palpable and electric. Walter's face had drained of color, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the badge Marcus held firmly in his hand. The officers beside him seemed unsure, glancing between Marcus and Walter, trying to process what had just happened. The disbelief in Walter's eyes was almost comical, if it weren't so serious. He had called the cops on the new chief of police, and now he was standing frozen, completely unprepared for the fallout. I don't think you understand, Marcus said, his voice low but firm. You just made a very big mistake. The officers, still processing, shifted their weight, unsure how to proceed. They had been called to deal with what they assumed was just another incident in a neighborhood that had seen its share of trouble, but they weren't ready for this. Walter, his initial shock giving way to defensive anger, quickly recovered and puffed his chest out. People like you don't belong here, he repeated, his voice shaking but resolute. This is my store, and I don't need any troublemakers. Marcus took a step forward, the weight of his position settling into his shoulders. Your store, or your perception of this place. I'm the chief of police, he said, his eyes narrowing as he studied Walter's expression, which shifted between disbelief and regret. Walter's hands trembled slightly, his eyes darting between Marcus and the officers, who now stood as if in suspended animation, too stunned to act. He had just insulted the very person who had the power to control this city's safety. You can't be the chief of police, Walter stammered. You're a young man, a black man. Marcus's jaw tightened at the underlying racism in Walter's tone. It wasn't the first time Marcus had faced such hostility, but this encounter stung more than usual. His eyes didn't leave Walter as he spoke. I earned my position. Now, you've made an accusation, and I want to know why. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, the younger man with short cropped hair, shifted his stance slightly, but did nothing to intervene. The other officer, older and more seasoned, watched the scene unfold, slowly realizing just how big of a mistake had been made. The silence stretched out. The only sound was the distant hum of city traffic and the faint murmur of pedestrians walking by. Walter stood frozen, caught in a trap of his own making, while Marcus patiently waited for an explanation. After a long, agonizing moment, Walter cleared his throat and tried to explain. I've been running this store for over 30 years. I've seen all kinds of people come and go, people who look like you ... He paused, as though struggling to put his thoughts into words without digging himself deeper. I don't trust strangers, and I don't trust changes. I've seen this neighborhood change, and it doesn't sit right with me. I don't care who you are or what badge you wear. Marcus clenched his fists, the old man's words ringing in his ears. Walter's attitude wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a glaring display of everything that Marcus had worked so hard to combat. The systems, the mindsets, the discrimination, they all lurk beneath the surface, ready to surface in situations like this. Your fear of change, Marcus said, his voice cool and controlled, is exactly why I'm here. And it's why I'm going to make sure that this kind of thing never happens again. He turned to the officers who were still standing idly by, unsure of how to proceed. You two should know better than this. Do your jobs. Make sure this doesn't happen again. The younger officer, still unsure of the situation, took a step toward Marcus. "Chief, I don't know what to say. This is something else." The older officer, realizing the gravity of the situation, cleared his throat and looked at Walter. "Sir," he said, his tone firm, "I think it's time for you to let the chief go. We'll take it from here." Walter's mouth snapped shut, his face red with embarrassment. The store, his little kingdom, had just been exposed for the narrow-minded space it had become. He didn't know how to process the reality that the man he had just tried to have arrested was the very person who controlled the fate of the entire city. But Marcus didn't wait for Walter to offer an apology or explanation. "I'll make sure to personally review your store's situation," Marcus said, his gaze unwavering. "And I think you'll find you've just become the talk of the city. I won't let this go unnoticed." Walter's eyes darted to the officers, silently pleading for them to intercede. But the officers only exchanged glances, unwilling to challenge the chief, who stood towering over him. As Marcus walked away from the scene, his mind raced. This incident was just the beginning. His presence in this neighborhood was already being questioned by the very people he was supposed to protect. But if Walter's reaction was any indication, there was much more work to be done. As he reached the corner of the street, he stopped and turned to the officers. "This isn't over. You're going to need to keep an eye on this place. I want to know everything about that store by the end of the week." With one last look at the officers, Marcus began to walk toward his car. As he did, he felt the weight of his badge, not just as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of the responsibility he carried. He had a long road ahead of him. The air in the city felt heavy as Marcus drove back to the station, the events of the day replaying in his mind. The sting of Walter's words still echoed in his ears. "People like you have no place here." It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the layers of history, of racism, of assumptions that those words represented. But what really gnawed at Marcus was the certainty in Walter's tone. The belief that Marcus, a black man, didn't belong in a neighborhood that had long been dominated by people who looked like Walter. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to shake the frustration that was building inside him. He had been through a lot in his career, but nothing had quite prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the ugly truth of how deep-seated some prejudices were, even in the face of authority. But that was exactly why he had taken on this job, to change the narrative, to make sure that no one, especially someone with the power to shape the city's future, was left feeling like they didn't belong. The drive to the station was short, but as he pulled into the parking lot, Marcus felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. His phone buzzed as he pulled into a space, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from his assistant, Rachel. "Rachel, we need to talk about the press conference. Some people are already talking about the incident at Walter's store. They're calling it just another example of the broken system." Marcus read the message and sighed. He knew this moment was coming. The media would latch onto this like a shark, to blood in the water. He had been preparing for something like this, but it wasn't supposed to be like this. Not today. Not with an old man who hadn't even realized who he was standing in front of. He typed a quick reply. "Marcus, I'm coming in now. We'll handle it. But I'm going to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. Let's meet in an hour." Marcus locked his car and made his way into the building. The station was quieter than usual. Most of the officers had gone out on patrol, leaving only the few who were working late to file reports or handle administrative tasks. The lights in the hallway flickered as Marcus walked past, but he didn't pay much attention. His mind was elsewhere, thinking about the next steps. When he reached his office, he opened the door to find Rachel sitting at the desk, looking over a stack of papers. She was in her late 20s, with sharp features and an even sharper mind. She had been his right hand ever since he was appointed, and today, he was more grateful for her presence than ever before. "How's the situation with the media?" Marcus asked, As he dropped into the chair across from her, Rachel looked up from her notes, her expression serious. The moment you walked into Walter's store, the story broke. Everyone's talking about it. Social media is blowing up. Some people are defending you, but others are, well, you can imagine. There's a lot of backlash from the older crowd. They're calling you everything from too young to not qualified. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had known there would be a challenge, but this wasn't about the usual pushback he had expected. This was personal. He wasn't just fighting for the badge on his chest anymore. He was fighting against a mentality that had been ingrained in people for decades. "Any word from the mayor?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Rachel hesitated before responding. "I've heard whispers that the mayor is worried. The last thing they want is a scandal. And this is the kind of thing that could make people question your legitimacy." Marcus rubbed his forehead. "This is bigger than just me, Rachel. This is about changing a system that's been broken for years. The problem isn't me, it's the way people still think. I'll handle the press, but we need to be prepared for the fallout." Rachel nodded, making a note on her notepad. "I'll set up a press conference. We can spin this, but it's going to take careful messaging. We need to get ahead of the narrative before it spirals out of control." Just then, Marcus's phone buzzed again. It was a text from the younger officer, who had been on the scene at Walter's store. His message was short, but to the point. "Officer Rodriguez, the store's owner is already making statements. He's calling you an imposter and saying you don't belong in that uniform. He's got a platform in the community, so this is only going to escalate." Marcus clenched his jaw. Walter's defiance wasn't surprising, but it only made him more determined to put an end to the narrative that people like him were somehow undeserving of authority. He couldn't let Walter's words or anyone else's dictate how the rest of the city would see him. "We need to handle this fast," Marcus said, standing up from his chair. "I'm going to the press conference. Prepare a statement, but I want us to be transparent. We don't have time for half-truths or cover-ups." Rachel stood up, ready to follow his lead. "Understood. I'll make sure everything is lined up." As they walked toward the elevator, Marcus's phone buzzed once more. It was a tweet from an influential local journalist, someone whose opinions carried weight in the community. Journalist, a black man in charge of the police. "What's next? Allowing criminals to police themselves? We need to ask hard questions about who really belongs in positions of power." Marcus felt his blood boil as he read the tweet, but he didn't let it show. He had been called worse, and he knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a road he was prepared to walk. "We're not just going to respond to the media," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We're going to make sure everyone knows exactly who's in charge here." Rachel shot him a glance of understanding. "And that includes Walter." Marcus nodded. "He'll get his turn." As they reached the press room, Marcus could already hear the murmur of reporters outside the door. The moment he stepped in front of the cameras, he would have to show the world exactly who he was. He would have to prove to the people who doubted him, to the ones who thought he didn't belong, that he wasn't going anywhere, and that Walter's words, those words, meant to belittle him, would only make him stronger. The press conference was scheduled for later that afternoon, and as Marcus walked into the room, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The cameras were already flashing, and reporters were murdering amongst themselves, eager to get a soundbite. He had done interviews before, but today was different. Today, it wasn't just about answering questions, it was about making a statement, about showing the world that he was a force to be reckoned with. Rachel was already at the podium, her voice steady as she briefed the press. She nodded at Marcus when she saw him enter, a silent signal that everything was ready. He gave her a brief smile before taking his place at the front. "Good afternoon, everyone," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "I know there's been a lot of talk surrounding my presence in this city, and I'm here to clear the air. I want to address what happened at Walter's store and the comments that have been circulating since then. A few reporters raised their hands, eager to ask questions, but Marcus held up his hand, signaling that he would speak first. He needed to set the tone, to take control of the narrative. The situation at Walter's store was an unfortunate misunderstanding, but it's not just about what happened that day. It's about what those actions represent. People like me, people of color, have spent far too long being questioned, being doubted, being told that we don't belong in positions of power. I'm here to tell you that I belong here just as much as anyone else in this city. I am your chief of police, and I will make sure that this city is a place where everyone is treated equally, no matter their race, background, or identity. There was a moment of silence in the room, and then the questions began. The first reporter stood up, his tone sharp. "But Chief, some people are calling your appointment a political move. They're saying that the city has made you chief of police to placate certain groups. What do you say to that?" Marcus didn't flinch. "What I say is that I earned this position. I didn't get here because of politics. I got here because of hard work, dedication, and the belief that change is possible. If you want to question my qualifications, that's fine, but I've been in this job long enough to know what needs to be done, and I'm doing it." Another reporter chimed in, this one clearly agitated. "You've got a lot of support from certain groups, but there are plenty of people who are concerned about your ability to lead. After all, you've only been in charge for a few months. How do you plan to address the backlash from those who don't believe you're up to the task?" Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room as he looked at each reporter. "I'm not here to win a popularity contest. I'm here to do what's right. The job isn't about making friends. It's about ensuring justice is served. We're going to address the concerns of the community, but we're not going to let fear and prejudice dictate how we run this department." The questions continued, each one aimed at digging into his leadership, his background, and his qualifications. But Marcus answered each one with the same calm confidence, refusing to let anyone undermine his authority. He wasn't just fighting for his position, he was fighting for the future of the city, for the people who had been silenced for too long. As the conference wore on, Marcus couldn't help but notice that some of the reporters seemed more interested in his personal story than the job itself. One of them, a woman in her 30s with an inquisitive look in her eyes, raised her hand and asked, "Chief, I think what people are really wondering is, how do you handle the kind of pressure you're under? How do you keep going when there are people who are actively trying to tear you down?" Marcus smiled, but there was a hardness to his expression. "It's not easy," he admitted. "I won't lie about that. But when you know what you're doing is right, when you know that you're fighting for something bigger than yourself, the pressure doesn't matter. The noise doesn't matter. What matters is what we do next." Another reporter piped up, "So, how do you respond to the criticisms coming from people like Walter, who are calling you an imposter and saying that you don't belong in this uniform?" Marcus's expression darkened, but he kept his voice steady. "I've heard those words before. People like you have no place here. It's a sentiment that's been passed down through generations. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to let the words of one man define who I am or what I can accomplish. The only place I belong is right here, doing this job, and I'll prove it every day." The room was quiet for a moment. Marcus could feel the tension hanging in the air, the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't just defending himself, he was defending his right to exist in this space, to occupy this position of power. He was showing the world that no matter how many people doubted him, no matter how many obstacles were placed in his way, he was going to rise above it all. The reporters seemed to sense the shift in the room. They had been hoping for a scandal, for a misstep they could latch onto, but instead, they were faced with a man who wasn't backing down. "Thank you, Chief," one of the reporters said, standing up as the session came to a close. "We'll be following up with you soon." Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the room one last time before he walked off the stage. Rachel was waiting for him backstage, her face a mixture of concern and pride. "You handled that well," she said quietly, her voice low. But you know this isn't over, right? Marcus gave her a small smile. I know, but we're not done yet. As they walked out of the building, Marcus could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. But it wasn't the same weight he had felt earlier. This time, it was the weight of responsibility, of knowing that the fight wasn't just for his career, it was for the future of the city, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong, and he wasn't going to stop until that fight was won. The sun had set by the time Marcus arrived at the precinct, the day's events weighing heavily on his mind. He had spent hours answering questions, shaking hands, and trying to calm the storm of criticism that was swirling around him. Despite his resolve, the night felt heavier than usual. As he entered the building, the familiar hum of activity greeted him. But something was different today. There was an undercurrent of tension, an energy in the air that he couldn't quite place. His deputy, Anna, approached him as he made his way to his office. Her face was drawn, and there was a look of concern in her eyes. Marcus, we need to talk, she said, her voice soft but urgent. Marcus nodded, gesturing toward his office. Let's talk inside. Once the door was closed, Anna wasted no time getting to the point. I've been hearing some disturbing rumors. People are saying things about you, about your ability to lead. Some of the officers are questioning whether you're the right person for this job. They don't believe you have what it takes. Marcus took a deep breath, leaning against his desk. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it out loud still stung. What do they want? What do they think I should do? Anna shook her head. I don't know, but it's spreading. Some of the older officers are especially resistant. They don't want change. They're comfortable with the way things were, even if that means letting things slide or turning a blind eye to problems that need to be addressed. You've made it clear that you won't tolerate that, and some of them aren't happy about it. Marcus clenched his jaw. He had always known that change would be met with resistance, but hearing that it was coming from within his own department felt like a betrayal. I can't control what people think, but I can control how I lead. And I'm not going to back down. Not now. Anna seemed to consider his words for a moment before responding. I know you're strong, Marcus, but there's a lot at stake here. If these rumors spread too far, it could undermine your authority. The city is watching, and we can't afford to let this spiral out of control. Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He had always known that being chief would come with challenges. But this was different. This wasn't just about policies or budgets. It was about the very culture of the department. A culture that he was trying to change. A culture that didn't want to change. I know, he said, his voice quieter now. I'll handle it. But we need to make sure the officers understand why things need to change. They need to see that we're not just cleaning up the streets. We're cleaning up the system. We need to make it clear that anyone who's not on board with that doesn't belong here. Anna raised an eyebrow. You're going to force them out. Marcus shook his head, his eyes hardening. No, but I'll give them the choice. They can either get on the bus, or they can get off the road. Anna didn't respond right away, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she nodded. I think I know what you're getting at. But Marcus, be careful. Some of these officers have been around longer than you have. They have connections. They have influence. Marcus stood up straighter, his resolve solidifying. I didn't come here to make friends, Anna. I came here to make a difference. If they don't like it, they can find somewhere else to work. But they will respect me, and they will respect this office. There was a long silence between them, and for a moment, Marcus could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. He was staking everything on this moment. If he didn't take control now, if he let the resistance grow, it could all slip away. He wasn't about to let that happen. Not after everything he had fought for. Okay, Anna said after a long pause, her voice softer now. I trust you, but you've got to be smart about this. You've got to play the long game. Don't rush in head first. You need to have a plan. I have a plan, Marcus replied, his tone unwavering. And it starts tonight. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus met with key officers individually, making sure that they understood his vision and what he was trying to accomplish. He held meetings with his department's top brass, laying out clear goals and expectations for the future. And as the days passed, he began to see a shift. Slowly, the resistance started to dissipate. Some officers still grumbled behind his back, but others were starting to come around. They were beginning to see that Marcus wasn't just a symbol of change, he was a force to be reckoned with. But there was still one obstacle that lingered in the background. Walter, the store owner who had called the cops on Marcus, the one who had made the comment that still echoed in Marcus's mind, had not been silent. He had taken to the local news outlets, claiming that Marcus was unqualified and had only been appointed to appease certain groups. His words were poisonous, and they were spreading like wildfire. Marcus knew he needed to address Walter, but he wasn't sure how to approach it. He wasn't the type to seek revenge, but he couldn't let this man's slander go unchecked. He was the chief of police, and he needed to make sure that people like Walter understood that they couldn't undermine his authority without consequences. One evening, Marcus decided to pay Walter a visit. He wasn't sure what he would say or what the outcome would be, but he knew that he couldn't allow the rumors to fester. He needed to confront Walter directly, to show him that Marcus was not someone to be intimidated. When he arrived at the store, Walter was behind the counter, looking up in surprise as Marcus walked in. The two men locked eyes for a moment, the tension palpable in the air. "You," Walter said, his voice dripping with disdain. "What do you want?" Marcus stepped forward, his posture rigid. "I'm here to talk." Walter scoffed, clearly not interested in what Marcus had to say. "Talk? About what? I don't have time for this." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "I don't care what you think. You've been spreading lies about me, and I'm here to put an end to it." Walter leaned forward, his expression hardening. "People like you have no place here, Marcus, and you're going to find that out soon enough." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but Marcus didn't flinch. He knew that Walter's attitude was more than just personal animosity, was a reflection of something deeper, something systemic, and Marcus wasn't about to let it stand. The air outside was cool as Marcus stepped out of the store, the weight of the conversation still heavy on his shoulders. Walter's words echoed in his mind like a constant reminder of the battle ahead. "People like you have no place here." The phrase seemed to pulse with an underlying hostility, a sentiment that went beyond just one man's opinion. It was a reflection of the very attitude that Marcus had been fighting against since the moment he'd walked into this office. But he wasn't going to let it break in. As he walked back to his car, he could feel the familiar sense of determination creeping back into his veins. He knew that this was only one battle in a long war. He had already made progress. He had changed policies, started conversations, and pushed for transparency. He had faced resistance head-on, and in some ways, he had already won. But Walter's words had made one thing clear. There were still deep-rooted issues in this city, and those issues weren't going to disappear overnight. The fight wasn't just about police reform, it was about changing hearts and minds, and that was going to take more than just policy shifts. Later that evening, as Marcus sat in his office, reviewing reports, his phone rang. It was Anna. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight. "You need to see this." Marcus's brow furrowed. "What is it?" "There's a protest downtown. It's about you. And it's not what we expected." Marcus stood up, grabbing his coat as he walked toward the door. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. "Is it violent?" "Not yet, but it's growing fast. I think Walter has something to do with it." Marcus's mind raced as he made his way to the protest. He had been prepared for backlash, he had expected it. In fact, but the speed at which this protest was gaining traction caught him off guard. As he arrived downtown, he saw a sea of people gathered in front of City Hall, chanting slogans and holding signs. The protest was peaceful for now, but the tension was palpable. As Marcus approached, he could see Anna standing near the front lines, speaking with several officers. When she saw him, she waved him over. "Marcus, this isn't just about you," she said as he approached. "This has escalated. People are angry, and Walter's name is being shouted alongside yours. They're saying you're not doing enough for the community, that you're just a pawn for the system." Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, the anger rising in him once again. "This is more than just about me. They're using my name as a way to attack the entire department, but they don't understand what we're trying to do here." Anna looked at him carefully, her expression serious. "We can't just ignore this. You're the chief now. You need to make a statement. You need to show them that you're not afraid, that you're not going to back down." Marcus glanced at the crowd, his mind spinning. It wasn't enough to simply talk about change. He had to show them that he was leading it. If this protest was going to turn into a movement, he had to take control of the narrative. He had to make sure that people knew what he stood for. "Where's Walter?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Anna pointed toward a small group of protesters near the stage. And there he was, Walter, front and center, holding a megaphone and shouting at the crowd. His face was red with anger, his eyes wild as he rallied the people around him. "Time to put an end to this," Marcus muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he approached Walter. Walter didn't see Marcus coming until it was too late. He was so wrapped up in his speech that he didn't notice the chief standing right behind him until Marcus's voice cut through the air. "Walter." Walter froze, his megaphone lowering as he turned to face the man who had become the object of his scorn. "What do you want, Marcus?" Walter sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "I want to talk," Marcus said, his tone cool but firm. "But I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to make one thing clear." Walter's expression hardened. "You've done enough talking. People like you have no place here, Marcus, and you're about to find that out the hard way." Marcus took a step forward, his eyes locked on Walter's. "You think I'm afraid of you? Of your words? You're just one man, and I've faced far worse than you. This protest, this movement, it's not about me. It's about the future. It's about what kind of city we want to be. And I'm not going to let you hijack that." Walter scoffed, but Marcus could see the uncertainty flicker in his eyes. "You think you can change anything? You're just a pawn in the system. Nothing will ever change, no matter how hard you try." Marcus shook his head, a small smile forming on his lips. "I'm not the pawn, Walter. I'm the one making the moves. And you'll see that soon enough." With that, he turned to face the crowd, his voice rising above the noise. "Listen up. I'm here to tell you that I'm not backing down. We've made progress, but the work is far from over. I'm here to listen, and I'm here to lead. We're not just changing policies. We're changing lives. And if you want to be part of that, I welcome you. If you don't, then maybe it's time to step aside." The crowd grew quiet as Marcus's words rang out, and for a moment everything seemed to hang in the balance. The silence was broken by a few murmurs, and then slowly people started to clap. It wasn't a loud applause, but it was something. It was a signal that there were those who believed in what Marcus was doing, who understood the message he was trying to send. And for the first time in what felt like days, Marcus allowed himself a breath of relief. He had faced Walter, had faced the resistance, and had come out stronger for it. But he knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But he was ready. If you like this story, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, in order to strengthen our community, I would like to know where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video.